right, let's talk about Stonewall Jackson's Way. A little bit of review time here. Always have to do some, right? And now, of course, I'm afraid that I've screwed up. I have to check again. Yeah, it's not zooming or anything, so you won't see the inside of my shirt fibers. You may not see everything you want to, but try to do what I can. All right, so in the intro and elsewhere, I made a lot of comparisons to this between this and Lee versus Grant, which was sort of the prototype of this design that Wachowski, I think, did the first time. I don't know how I stand on the comparison between the two. Maybe we'll get there. Let's talk a little bit about components first. First of all, and I mentioned this before, nice paper maps. Yay! Very strange for Avalon Hill. Charlie Kibler did the artwork on these. They're, as is sometimes the case, they're more works of beauty than they are of functionality. They don't glare out at you the way the Lee versus Grant maps do. I found them largely functional, but there were definitely things that I would have liked to stick out a little bit better. Quite a bit, actually. But they're pretty. And much, much better than the hard maps of the era. All the different options for mounted maps back then really kind of sucked in my view. Got a bunch of these from different magazines, including one from Operations magazine that has a picture of Stonewall Jackson's Way, but it actually doesn't use any of the maps from Stonewall Jackson's Way. It uses, what is it? Here Come the Rebels, I think, and something called RTG. Roads to Gettysburg, probably. You might be able to get some of this in real on there. I didn't bother looking. Counters. Well, like the Lee versus Grant counters, it uses individual strength point markers under each, well, for each unit. Instead of having individual leaders, as many individual leaders, it represents the leaders as formations more. So you have divisions, brigades, even regiments that have their own artillery component, which can't be reduced except by losing the entire formation or absorbing it into something else. Along with a leadership value. The leadership value means less in this game. It's a functional design, but you didn't have the capacity to absorb a core in quite the way that you did in Lee versus Grant. You always have to keep your divisions, etc., as separate units, and they can clog up your movement. That may be more realistic. It does create a little bit of difficulty in the gameplay. There's the Union units. Some extra units that I'm told come from a skirmisher magazine. It's just some of the corps leaders with slightly different values on them. I don't have the article that they come from, so I can't say much about them. It's apparently to bring it more in line with the later editions of the rules or something like that. Informational counters. Yeah, this is where I want to really gripe, because the fatigue markers are all generic. You use the yellow-orange counters for both sides. Now, demoralization counters, not so much so. But the most important piece of information when I'm trying to assess the map is how much fatigue do the units have. And it would be very, very helpful for me to see that as the top counter on the map. That's how I use them, is to represent how much fatigue by putting them on top of the units. That allowed me to quickly assess which units I want to can move. The only problem with it is because they're not showing the side that they're on, they don't have, it's very difficult to tell just who's sitting under that. Is that a Union or Confederate Union? That made it very difficult. It also made it painful to kind of see sort of the overall picture very well. It looked like, oh, well, a bunch of people have moved. That's about it. County display, we'll talk about this a little later, but this has to do with the supply rolls. You don't need it a lot of times in the game. Do you need to have this big sheet for it? I don't know. It seems a little overblown for it, but it does help you find the counties. The counties are hard to discern on the map, so that's important. A couple of complex big piles of player aid. They're copies, one for each player. They contain most of the information you want: combat, movement. Oh, I didn't see the summary of combat results here. A whole series of what the combat procedure is, which again I didn't really use. I found myself flipping through the book for some of this stuff, certainly for the combat results, which probably I shouldn't have had to. No, I shouldn't have. This contains all the information I need. I don't know if they're actually missing anything that you need for normal play of the game, except for one thing. It would have been nice to have the victory points for the grand scenario presented somewhere. If I play this again, I'm going to probably write up a little cheat sheet for that. It's not that big a deal. The force displays, these are no big deal. They're just holding boxes. They don't serve any specific purpose, like you can't move a force as one thing. Somebody pointed this out. I hadn't been doing it for the most part. Early on when I started playing, I effectively, I think, was doing it. That's important because when you're moving, when you enter a hex with your own pieces, you pay a cost for it. You also pay a cost for leaving an enemy zone of control and a number of other things that are kind of weird. The rulebook itself actually read really well for an Avalon Hill rulebook. The only problem, I always go for the problems, right? I mean, it's the easiest thing to do when you're looking at a review. Hey, what thing stuck in my mind is, well, that sucked. Because I'm a negative person, I don't, really think too much. Oh, what was so great about this? Even if I had a good time with something, you'll see some of my games that I love. I'm like just tearing them apart because I can find all these little things to hook into. But if you think they'll stick in your craw too much, that's one of the most useful things in a review, because obviously we're all predisposed to buy stuff, right? It sounds exciting. It's operational American Civil War. I want it, obviously, right? The only thing here is that there's some rules in the second section, so you have to kind of page through the scenarios for the basic game to get to some of the rule set. It's a little bit of an annoyance, but really pretty minor. I'm pretty impressed with this rule book. Again, except for one thing, those victory conditions, not only are they, not presented in some little cheat sheet, but they're actually presented in a kind of annoying fashion that's hard to process all the information from them. But it's not that big a deal. All right, play of the game. Let's take the sequence of play and see what we can talk about here. It's got a random events phase, straight from the Lee versus Grant type system, but the random events are a little bit more generic, I think. I don't know. What's kind of neat is you get random events every turn, but usually they don't have any effect. They might be like, next turn's reinforcements come in a turn early. Well, that doesn't matter if there are none, right? Reinforcements, those are slated by by a reinforcement chart for the scenario, which, makes more sense in some ways than the Lee versus Grant. Hey, I'm just getting huge quantities of troops. Where did these all come from? Which has kind of a random reinforcement set up, but yeah, that's fine. You're allowed to shift your leaders around next, which it lets you take advantage of certain capabilities that Corps or even the Army commanders have by shifting them to a place where they're more needed for that. Supply lines. Okay. Supply is handled twice in the game, and this is very much like Lee versus Grant. In that game, supply is handled at the end of every turn, which is essentially every 3 action phases. In this, It's handled during turns 6 and 11 only. What this means is you have this weird fixed pattern of, you could be out of supply most of the time, duck back in on turn 6, just before turn 6, be in supply at the beginning of turn 6, and boom, you can operate until turn 11 without any supply considerations. And then, better be in supply that turn, and then you can operate for the rest of the game without any supply considerations at all. This creates a little bit of an artificial timing situation. This is one of my big gripes with both of the games. I think it's actually worse in this one. Wow, I see something hanging down that's really bugging me. It looks like a piece of paper from a game or something that's scaring me. So, what is this artificial timing thing? Well, I can be essentially fully supplied on turn 5, and if I start marching and cross my supply boundaries, and this is kind of weird, the supply boundaries are delimited by this, and they're on the map, which is, hey, the Confederates are in supply in all these areas, the Union are supply in counties on the map that they have either a depot or a rail line that gets somewhere in the county. It doesn't have to actually make it to the unit or anything, it just has to get, the unit can be completely surrounded for the whole game. It just has to get somewhere in that county and they'll find supplies somehow, some way. I find this actually a more painful supply system than the one in Lee versus Grant. And because it's assessed less often, the timing consideration bugs me even more in this. It's almost like, I thought, wow, they changed it, they fixed it, they made turns only a day each, supplies can be assessed all the time. Nope, they made it much, much worse for me. Anyway, what it means is that you could essentially be almost fully supplied if you had waited a turn later, but for some reason you only get your supplies on Saturday, you will not fill your wagons on any other day, or it's actually a 6-day cycle, so it's not always Saturday, but well, Sunday's day of rest, right? No. Anyway, that whole supply system really bothers me. It also kind of bothers me that you can forage and you get up to full supply once you forage. So the idea of forces that were unable to maintain their supply for nearly a week have run out of all their quality, all of the food, and frankly, it could be ammo as well. Depending on how much you've been fighting, this game probably doesn't have a lot of fighting, but if you've been playing kind of, I don't know, poorly, if one player is playing kind of poorly, notably probably the Confederates, there may have been a lot of attacks in the game, and if that's the case, you should have ammo considerations as well. Does that detail all have to be covered in, real minutia? No, it doesn't, but it does seem kind of strange that one day not moving and foraging will get me enough food for the rest of the week and enough ammo for however many battles I want to fight, if that is even a part of this consideration. Certainly, like if you've played Terrible Swift Sword or whatever, 3 days of battle gets your ammo supplies down, right? Especially for artillery. And you just find that, just lying around, right? Enough food for the week. Maybe. Or maybe you just don't find anything, in which case you start starving to death. Or people start leaving because they don't like eating their shoes. Anyway, it's an abstraction that I really don't like the way it's handled in this. The alternatives, though, would be keeping track of per unit or possibly per corps supply. Per corps is kind of weird because your corps could end up split up all over the map and it wouldn't really make sense. You don't want to do that. You really don't want to do that. But if you're me, it happens no matter what, because, well, the counters are not, this is one gripe against the regular counters, they're not color-coded, say, the way they are in Lee versus Grant. So you can't tell who's aligned with which command, even though in Lee versus Grant you could conceivably actually switch people from one command to another, and you can't do that here. Although you could detach strength points from a unit and send it somewhere else. I didn't do that. Okay. Attachments, you're allowed to absorb some units. Now there's specific rules on which units can attach to what. A lot of them, it's a matter of if it's below it seems largely to be kind of below divisional and in its own core, but that's not an absolute rule at all, so you have to kind of go look up the units. Some of the units, they can attach to anything. Makes sense with units that are kind of independent, not so much sense in some of the other cases. I think some core units can attach. I don't remember, I didn't bother too much with restricting myself completely to that. You have the feeling that, the commanders probably could have worked around that if need be, and to some extent. Okay. The main flow of the game is an action cycle, which is just like a Lee versus Grant one in a lot of ways. You roll a pair of dice, or each player rolls a die. The high roller gets the initiative. There's a little bit of difference here. That's not a guaranteed win, right? In Lee versus Grant, you win the initiative. You can tell the other guy, yeah, why don't you go? In this, you can't. You can either take the initiative or pass. And if you pass and the other guy passes, the turn's over. So if you have anything you want to get done and you want to get more done than you think your opponent wants to get done, well, you probably don't want to pass. There's also the opportunity in this of an automatic end of turn. If you both roll ones, there's a chance that the turn just ends right there, and that can be pretty extreme. Strangely, there's something strange about both the systems, which is if your troops didn't do anything, they got to do something while they were not doing anything. But you don't know that they're not doing anything for sure, because later on you might move them in the turn during the activation cycle. So it's actually possible that nobody was doing anything, they were all entrenching, or some of them were building a bridge or something like that. I didn't build a single bridge. That's a sign of something. Okay. You have some special activations, so you're allowed to activate a core all at once. It doesn't move all at once. You move each unit individually. They can't attack in a coordinated fashion. But what this helps you with, and the reason you'd want to do it, is because turns can end early, so you might want, at least starting with turn 3 in the campaign game, you might want to get your units moving more quickly. So another reason why you don't want to just pass and try to force the other guy, even if he has things he wants to do, to take his actions first. It may well end up that you won't get all your units a chance to move if you don't get activations. It's possible the turn ends too early for that. The recovery phase, that allows you to recover from fatigue. Now, fatigue is the limiting factor in the action phase. The way fatigue works is you go do something. Now, you can also do core attacks where everybody in the core in one hex is allowed to hit, and that can expand. If you have the army leader in command there, that can expand to include other units adjacent to the hex that you're attacking. Anyway, we'll get to combat in a moment. But the way recovery works is basically, if you have fatigue markers, which you get every time you do something, you get a fatigue marker. You can also pick them up in battle. You can pick up a lot of them that way. If you retreat before combat, you can get them with the cav. Well, you get 2 of them back in the recovery phase. And then if you're down to 0 and you're disorganized, you get to recover your organization. Mixed in with this is the supply situation. So before you do the recovery, you make a roll on the supply chart and see whether or not, this is if you're out of supply, whether or not you found everything you need. You found whole wagons full of food and ammo just lying around, basically, in the course of a day. Otherwise, you might not find anything. If you find nothing, you become disorganized, and if you were already disorganized, you start losing strength points because you're, eating your own men or shooting out of the cannon or something. Just leaving. But okay. Recovery phase. If you did nothing on the turn, if you didn't have to remove a fatigue marker at all, you only recover 2 fatigue in each one, and the fatigue goes up to 4. You're allowed to do something else. Basically, you did nothing during the turn, so maybe you were digging in, building a boat, building a bridge. You can't do either of those if you forage, though. Okay, let's go back to the way combat works. Combat kind of disturbed me in this. It's not really that different from the Lee versus Grant system, but I understand that the system has changed since this. The way it used to work, the way it worked in this, is the attacker adds his both sides add their artillery value. Their artillery value is modified by the terrain you're in. It's kind of the only thing that involves the terrain, or the terrain the battle's in. So if you're attacking the defender in clear terrain, the artillery works better. And if you have lots of artillery, that's a bonus to you. If you're attacking in the middle of the woods, artillery doesn't count for shit. And if you don't have much artillery, that's probably good for you. There are modifiers to your combat capability from terrain, but they're basically, there are a couple of them that are hex side based, which is you're defending behind a water barrier. And then mountains are a bonus, and there's a bonus for fighting against the Union when they're panicking. Other than that, you have other modifiers that are in place. You have a reductio ad absurdum system where the odds ratio is a modifier to the damage to the die roll you're going to have. You have a leadership modifier. You have a flank bonus, which is basically if you have the enemy surrounded with zones of control, you're able to get some, and it doesn't have to be fully surrounded. You get some bonuses there. You have the concept of attacks on the march in this game, which the more movement points you spend, the better prepared your attack is, and basically, in general, you're trying to get to not getting a penalty against yourself, but you can actually get a bonus if you spend 4 movement points for infantry. I've got cav spend more for attack. I don't think I did a lot of cav attacks. And a core assault action, which is the core is all together and right next to the enemy to begin the turn, that automatically gets the prepared assault bonus, basically. Oh, and the Union panic is in, because it's both things. The results are expressed, you roll the dice, you get a differential. So if I beat you by 5 and I'm attacking, we'll be on the +5 differential. If you beat me by 5 and I'm attacking, we'll be on the -5 differential up here. And you read across, compare the differential to the total strength value of the attacking and defending force. Now, they take out the effect of terrain in that. Fortifications primarily. Fortifications can multiply your total strength, and that's not included in here, but artillery is for some reason. I think that's different in the new system, among other things. Artillery becomes a modifier from what I understand, from what I've read. But here, it's just an addition to your strength point, and it increases the casualties you take. So if I have, 8 strength points of manpower and 4 strength points of artillery applied to the attack, I will be rolling on the 12 chart rather than just on my manpower. That really disturbs me, and it seems incorrect. I would actually rather use the, I think it's Der Weltkrieg has this concept. You add your firepower to the enemy's manpower, to get what chart they're on for that kind of attack. That may be too much for here, but that's what I kind of expected to see, or at least that the artillery wouldn't count. Neither of those is the case. Your full strength point value counts, and you take casualties based on it, which seems a little weird. I had a lot of artillery with me. I got hurt worse. I don't know why. Pissed the enemy off or something. The casualties are expressed as a numerical casualty, as well as a disorder effect, which disorganizes the force, weakens its strength, its combat value, without weakening the manpower, and fatigues it up to 4. Some retreats and routes, which only affect the defender ever. The attacker's never repulsed and sent running. Possibility of ending turn, ending your activation. I'm sorry, not turn, activation. Possibility of advancing. The actual, one of the problems I had with it is beating up on a small force is not a good thing necessarily. Beating up on a disorganized force, it's a little weaker. It takes less losses because now it's weaker. So if you have a large force hitting a small force and your differential ends up kind of lousy, you get a bad die roll against you, or you just didn't have good leadership, you can really get mauled doing that. You want to be careful not to attack small forces that are in good terrain or something. To some extent that seems to make sense. But some of the results seemed a little heavy in favor of the smaller force, just depending on the luck factor as well. Where were we? Okay. The overall flow of the game, this is a game which focuses on maneuver more than it focuses on trying to slam the enemy. I gotta tell you, Lee versus Grant does the same thing. The Zucker Napoleonics, to a lesser extent, do the same thing. There's more desire to attack there. Lee versus Grant's a little different because the Union is on the aggressor in that. They're willing to fight an attritional battle, or a series of attritional battles, until the Confederates dig in too well. In this game, in this situation, Lee really can't afford to trade losses in order to try to, get a lucky hit or something and break through. On the bright side, he's got lots of room for maneuver on these maps, so he's able to bypass the Union position where he wants to. It might take time, it might put him out of supply at some point or something. But you see a lot of, oh gee, they're kind of, I don't see an easy way across there and I want to get beyond them. I'm going to try to go around them and try to get there quickly. The Confederates have an advantage on the initiative roll, so they tend to get their actions more quickly. Or they can pass when they don't want to do anything else. Maybe most of their units are fatigued too. They want to keep some in reserve or something. The game does, like Lee versus Grant, it does reward reserves. And the fact that movement has a die roll involved with it, that's a nice feature to me. I've always kind of felt funny about fixed movement rates in games. The situation here, it kind of represents orders, failures, delays, stuff like that I love in my CWB games and all its derivatives. In the same way here, you start throwing a die roll for movement and units can't go quite as far. That pleases me in a similar sort of way. It really highlighted that maneuver aspect in a way that other games that cover the same topic and maybe actually simulate the maneuver just as well. And I'm thinking here the blue and gray system, where the same kind of, I talked about this at some length, the same kind of, oh gee, the enemy is blocking my paths across the river here, I'm going to have to go around them. That still applies in that game, but somehow it just doesn't seem as, I don't know, as depicted in quite as detailed a fashion as it is here. Some of it here is the fact that there's that die rolling movement, the fact that there's the unknown who's going to get the next action. So there's some tension generated there where you think you're sending your troops where they'll go, but you don't have that geometric certainty that you have in the I go, you go type games. And that's very nice as well. There's things I really like about the system. There's things I don't like so much. It was a nightmare in terms of fiddly counter messes. And off-map boxes just don't cut it for me. I think I prefer the Zucker system with strength points tracked under a commander. I definitely don't like having to move each little unit individually. Both Lee versus Grant and the Zucker systems, I feel, do a better job of keeping that from being obnoxious to me. You could penalize large stacks moving together if you wanted to, make them pay more. I did not like the supply system for this. I thought it just didn't represent reality particularly well. And I thought it was worse than it tends to be in Lee versus Grant. In Lee versus Grant, you have yep, I got 3 days supply right now, but if I start this move a little later, I got 2 days supply. Well, here it switched from 3 days to 6 days or something like that. So it's even more obnoxious because the scale has changed. I think it's 3 days supply. Maybe they're functionally equivalent. I do not like that answer. However, the alternative of tracking individual supply for units is ridiculous. At the core level, the core don't have quite enough impetus to stick together, and it's a pain in the butt to keep them together. You know, an opportunity arises, you run off, and you're like, ooh, well, this core is never getting back together. Because it's just not worth the effort to pull them back together. You'll be losing, a key unit. I did not like the victory points for the Grand Campaign at all. They infuriated me. Especially the Confederate units have to stick around in certain areas unless they're surrounded. I rant on it in the wrap, in the final video of the game. I'm not going to go into that again. It's horrible, and I feel like that needs to be reworked. Maybe that's reworked in the second edition. At some point, I will get Battle Above the Clouds played, maybe sometime soon. So we can take a look at how the most recent, I think there may be more, there are more since then, but sort of the most recent of this family are being handled. See if it started to improve and buff off some of those edges. As of right now, I don't think I like Stonewall Jackson's Way as much as I like Lee versus Grant. Both have an end game problem where the game becomes really, really, you're trying to optimize your final turn victory points too much. I don't like things like that. I feel like it should be pretty obvious where things are going to go. You're not going to run off and grab that key location on the last turn, just because, no penalty for running off and getting it now, which can happen in this. There's a lot of stuff in it that just is obnoxious. It brings you to the question of, am I trying? It really brings the binary victory conditions versus what your overall goals are into conflict in a way that not all games do. I mean, I'm thinking of things like Last Chance for Victory that I played. Again, tactical, so it's a little different, but where, it was pretty obvious what the victory situation was. You look at the casualties, you look at the situational and positional, and you can say, yep, I'm pretty sure so-and-so won. Of course, some of that has to do with just being fairly familiar with what the goals at Gettysburg were. Here, it's harder to tell what the goals are. what the fuck is Lee really doing here? You know, I'm gonna run up and damage the Union supply, and then I gotta get home because I got no supply myself. And okay, so it was a raid with an army. Sure. You know, maybe I'm threatening Washington. Maybe, I don't know. Anyway, so that's Stonewall Jackson's way. And my silly thoughts on it. We'll get maybe a little bit started on Arquebus before I have to leave for a couple weeks.